Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review a movie called Cooties. So, this is a very interesting film when looking at it. It's basically a kind of a zombie film, but it really very much more ties into kids. So, kind of when looking at it, it's a very oddball-ish like story, but I guess recently, when looking at it, the way of which this infection spreads, it seems like there is a much more reasonable answer. Where normally we would just be like, "Oh, the zombie infection just spreaded." In this one, there is much more of a much reliable thing to ultimately give us to give us to hand us like where exactly this origin of this infection started and to eventually where it breaks out into all of these kids that are ultimately at this school. So we seemingly have it to where we kind of focus like it's kind of funny because recently I had seen a movie called The Faculty, and it's kind of interesting to see Elijah Wood being a teacher in this movie. Well, in this case, he's a substitute teacher, ultimately with a character being called Clint. So we ultimately go in here and we have Elijah Wood's character that is a struggling writer, which ultimately when we are to find out that seemingly that there are people that find issues with his book and ultimately are just kind of laughing at his book. At some point, ultimately, he is to tell them the concept of it. And I thought that that was really interesting. I thought that that was really fun when we have like. I wish that there were actually more writers in movies. Like, I know it's something it seems kind of like dull or kind of stupid to be like, yeah, you have a writer that is ultimately like struggling writer in this movie, and I just like that kind of I like that kind of approach. Like I like movies like Orange County where it's just about a kid who is trying to get his book out there or trying to write, and we end up having it to where that main character ends up just writing about what he knows, which is being at Orange County and dealing with his brother and all the problems that are otherwise provided with being in Orange County. So I ultimately, as course as per usual, when we see Rainn Wilson seemingly in anything, it's normally a joke of sorts. It's normally to approach this in a very odd like way. Because normally we have it to where Rainn Wilson in this movie, I guess, is a PE teacher, I would assess or assume. Because ultimately it seems like the way of which that everybody is like dressing and whatever, it feels like there are definitely like certain like kind of stereotypical characters. We have it to where Doug is ultimately a seemingly a science teacher, of course. We have it to where Tracy, ultimately, we're not quite exactly sure what exact teacher he is of. But it seems like he's playing around a lot with the fact that he could quite possibly be gay. And while doing that, there's a lot of fun notions and things that he otherwise provides to maybe play around with the fact that like he has some stories that ultimately a lot of the women will ultimately be thinking like, oh, so he's really just like he is really, and then he ultimately kind of curves to the fact where it's like, oh no, it's just me and a guy just having just having fun or whatever, and we're doing this, we're doing that, and they're ultimately just like, oh, like okay, like dude, just tell us or not. So we ultimately have it to where Clint ultimately is to be the new kid in town of this school, but ultimately he's coming back from this town. He had ultimately left for a long time and then come back, and so now he's coming back to substitute for this school. And we seemingly have it to where when Clint goes into this student body, he's coming there unwelcomed, and ultimately having to deal with any number of teachers that are ultimately just or just seemingly people in this school that are ultimately just kind of just looking at this guy as just like, oh, okay, you're going to be here for a day and then be gone. So going on to this movie, we have it to where reasonably there's an infection, and eventually we have it to where now the teachers are ending up having to be the otherwise people that are scared of children. And I think that that is the most hilarious thing possible. When going into this movie, you have it to where kids are trying to get in and try to get to these adults, and they're just like, "Oh my God, we're going to die," kind of thing. And we have it to where like the teachers are just consistently freaking out, and that I think is the most like they sell this movie really well. All these actors sell this movie really well, and that's the one thing that I really enjoy about this film is how you have these teachers that are otherwise terrified about what to do next. Or ultimately, we have it to where we really have a love triangle going on, which is really very much hilarious. To where ultimately we have this very much walkie-talkie like scene that is freaking hysterical, and ultimately the very first time like I watched this, because ultimately this is my second time around watching this movie. Like I just laughed so hard when we get to the walkie-talkie scene, and I was like, "Man, this is freaking hysterical." So, anyways, let's ultimately go into spoilers. Kind of get through this movie. I really enjoy it. Like it's like I enjoy it because it's silly. I like the silliness of this movie. I like the silliness of the writing. I think a lot of people got to be able to like experiment and ad lib and see how everything goes. We had it to where Doug's character is kind of hilarious and kind of like kooky and whatever, to the point of him like. But it also seems like there's also some people that have to keep going at the same well for some reason within this movie. But ultimately, I guess it's just them thinking that, well, more than likely that line could have probably gotten cut out at any point in time. So maybe there was 500 other times where we had it to where Doug said this, or Wade said that, or Tracy said this, and Clint said that, and so on and so forth. And they cut it out for time or whatever reason. So going into this movie, let's go into spoilers. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I could just say that this is yet another zombie film that ultimately just ties more into kids this time, and that's what ultimately just makes it a little bit different. Uh, different, different, but like it's not like trying to really reinvent the zombie wheel. If anything, it's just a lot of time where you have like the more experienced actors being in a room somewhere terrified or trying to figure out what is all going on. It's a lot of that where they're all just in a room kind of scared, and then they're ultimately going and looking outside to see what these zombies are doing at some point in time. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So we ultimately have it, like I said, we have it to where Elijah Wood's character Clint is to get up in the morning to get prepared for his day of substitution, and we ultimately have it to where his mom comes in and is ultimately telling him like, "Hey, it's time to get ready for school," and so we have it to where Clint ultimately tells his mother like, "Hey, did you read my book?" And she's like, "Yeah, I read your book," and so it seems like his mother is saying all kind of nice things about it and this and that. And ultimately, Clint is like, you know what? I can take criticism, Mom. Ultimately, you can kind of just tell me like how you really felt about the book. Like if ultimately, if you don't criticize it, then I won't learn, kind of thing. And so ultimately, we have it to where Clint's mom is ultimately just kind of going off about everything that she hated about the book, and she didn't understand, and so on and so forth. And so he ended up having Clint going, "Oh, I guess she didn't really like the book." Oh. So We end up having Clint going off to school, and so while he's doing that, he is like trying to like have a recorder present to kind of think about the way of which that he's going to write this book or rewrite this book. Ultimately, mentioning how like that his main character had realized that this boat had been haunted, and normally like he has been kind of going through the motions of thought of like how this character had felt about it, and how ultimately he either accepted it or ultimately thought it was he wasn't sure how much more haunted that this boat actually was, and so on and so forth. So we end up having Elijah go into this school like it's nobody's business, and so immediately he ends up going into uh, the teachers' lounge. So we end up having Elijah just kind of going like, "Hey, hey, everybody, hi, everyone," and so recently we have it to where everybody is treating him like he doesn't even exist, and we have it to where it's seemingly that Clint is ultimately to approach one teacher, and she's ultimately to mention that she has a button on her blazer. That ultimately, if she presses it, ultimately police will be sent right away to arrest Clint. Um, and Clint is like, okay, all right. We ultimately have it to where Clint is ultimately going and realizing that he is familiar with Lucy. It seems like they have had a past together, and ultimately, Clint is ultimately reminiscing about old times. It seems that Wade and Lucy seemingly have a relationship as well. It seems that Lucy is introducing Clint to Wade. Wade comes in and ultimately is mentioning about his dual reel, his dual wheel reel, his dual reel, his his double wheeled car, his double wheeled truck. So we end up having it to where ultimately Clint is explaining his book about it's a haunted boat, and ultimately we have it to where Wade is ultimately saying, "Oh, that's just like Christine," and Clint is like, "No, it's a haunted boat," and we have it to where like uh, like Wade is mentioning any horror movie that sounds anywhere close to being like familiar with this. Like I have actually heard of plenty of movies that have had a actual haunted boat on it. I remember the Jamie Lee Curtis movie Virus, and ultimately there is like movies like Ghost Ship or something along those lines. There's some movie with the girl that is from ER, and the guy who is ultimately in Unusual Suspects and Cool World. The guy who's the main character on Cool World, and also in Man in the Iron Mask, the guy that played D'Artagnan in Man in the Iron Mask. Ultimately, he had played in some ship movie, which I can't remember the name of. I'm sure that's probably Ghost Ship. But anyways, so but we have it to where Wade is explaining all these movies that make no rational sense to otherwise be tied to Clint's to tied to Clint's story, and otherwise just kind of say to the fact that like yeah you you don't know about stories. So we end up having Wade going off, and so recently it seems that that Clint and Lucy are consistently catching up, and eventually Wade is eventually seeing this from afar from doing some class, and ultimately we have Wade just kind of jealous of the fact that it's like, why can't I make her laugh like that, and so on and so forth, as if he's like seeing her laugh or whatever. So we end up finding out that at some point Wade had gotten a ring for Lucy. Like this relationship is actually getting serious. But we'll get on to that. So we eventually having Clint go to class, and eventually we have it to where we find out the origin this uh, of this of this Cooties, let's just say. So we find out in the very beginning of this movie that there's a farmer that ends up having to kill a chicken, and this chicken ends up being sick, I believe, and so we end up having this chicken ending up becoming chicken nuggets, and we find out that this chicken nuggets has some black goop of it of sorts, and so we end up having this chicken nugget being infected, and evidently when these people are going and having lunchtime, we end up having this kid eat this chicken nugget and it's all black and goopy and stuff. And so this girl evidently eats this chicken nugget and then all of a sudden becomes really sick and infected. We ultimately have it to where Clint is ultimately going and talking to this class, and he's like, you know what? How about instead of you calling me like calling me Mister whatever, like how about you just call me by my first name? How about you just call me Clint? And so ultimately, while he is writing out his name in chalk, ultimately one kid calls him cunt instead, and ultimately we have it to where he's like, no, my name is Clint. So we end up having it to where ultimately the teacher, to where Elijah is ultimately just like saying like, well, hey, how about we just forget about names right now? And so we end up having it to where Elijah is just like, you know what? I'm gonna have like a really fun day for you all. I've planned something out of the ordinary. We're gonna like drop everything that you're doing from your curriculum. I can't say that effing word. From the stuff that you're doing in normal class, let's just say. And we have it to where Elijah is like, you know what I plan to do? I plan to have every single one of you all read my book. Does anybody want to come up and read my book? And so we have one of the kids start reading the book, and we have it to where Elijah is ultimately just going like, yeah, this is really fun. This is great. And ultimately we have it to where seemingly one of the girls is ending up getting infected. We have it to where eventually the kids are harassing her before like the bell rings, and so when we end up having Elijah uh, ending up having it to where he's noticing that this girl is really sick, they're like, well, what should we do? What should we do with this girl? Like, this girl looks really sick. And so eventually we have this girl ending up attacking one of the other students, ending up like biting on this guy's face really badly to the point where he needs stitches and needs to go immediately to a hospital to get stitches done. And to where Clint is just ultimately just like, well, I guess that's what happens when you're kind of being an a-hole to a lot of your kids in class. And ultimately Clint was just kind of happy that this kid had gotten the justice that he deserves, because we end up finding out that this kid was named Patriot, and that ultimately like he has this whole backstory going on and whatever. And we have it to where when Clint ends up getting bitten, we have it to where Clint is like ultimately just mentioning like, well, hey, like I'm sure you'll be fine to be able to get stitches. Like Clint is saying that sarcastically to Patriot, because like, yeah, I'm sure you'll be fine because you're a patriot, right? And so we end up pushing on. So we eventually find out that we find this girl ultimately like getting a chunk ripped out of her hair, and so ultimately that's when they like we eventually get it to where this girl eventually ends up like we have it to where these kids are eventually starting to attack one another in while they're at recess. They are all just starting to claw and attack one another, and we eventually have it to where like kids are even starting to eat one another. We had seemingly Rick, who ultimately is the man who is doing what is it called, a traffic duty. We end up having Rick go and like kind of traffic Elijah Wood into the school, and ultimately ask him like, "Hey, are you my weed dealer?" And Clint's like, "No." And so we have it to where Rick ultimately is getting the weed that he needs, and he is sitting in his van, and ultimately he is just seeing all this stuff go down, and he is high as a kite. And so Rick and ultimately ends up calling Vice Principal Sims and mentioning to him, it's like, hey, yeah, like, I don't know if this is the medication that I'm on or what, but ultimately I'm seeing kids, like, eat one another and, uh, and, uh, and crazily, like, attacking one another. And so we have the vice principal ending up going out in the playground, and we have it to where the kids are grabbing him by the arms, and we have it where the vice principal is like, "Hey, like I have a problem with my elbow." It's like I have tennis elbow. Like, hey, don't be grabbing me that hard. And so we ultimately find out that the vice principal ends up getting nibbled upon, while Rick is ultimately talking to some bizarre giraffe because he's high. So we ultimately have it to where recently people are starting to notice what is to go on outside of this school. And so we have it to where eventually all of the kids are, or all the teachers are getting together, and they're like, oh my god, like we are starting to see all of these kids all attack one another, and this is insane. And so eventually we have it to where the teachers are all running around because they are getting scared by seeing kids eventually run through hallways and such that ultimately are infected. Ultimately, we have it to where the teachers all try to like lock themselves in seemingly one room, where they end up finding a kid. Where ultimately their first question is like, "Kid, are you scarred up and or bleeding by chance?" And ultimately the kid's like, "No, I'm completely fine." And they're like, "Are you sure?" Because ultimately they can't really see anything. But ultimately the kid is absolutely fine. So like, oh, thank God. So we end up finding that Elijah's character is had gotten clawed by one of the girls, and it eventually seems that Elijah is ultimately getting sick. So we end up having Doug end up taking Elijah to another room, separating him from everyone else. And so we find out that Doug is ending up like doing a analysis on Clint's health, ultimately mentioning like, yeah, he's really sick. Like he has anal leakage and like all of this stuff, and like and ultimately we also have Doug who has to go and examine Clint's poop, I guess. So we end up having Doug consistently telling people to please be quiet, even though they are already quiet. They're all waiting to hear what Doug has to say, and he's like, "Please be quiet." And ultimately, you have people like Rebecca that is ultimately telling him, like, "Hey, we're already quiet," and he's like, "Rebecca, what did I say?" Be quiet. Like, I need to tell you guys something. And so, and this guy keeps going to that same well repetitiously, but I still think that it's funny every single time. Even when everyone is being quiet, he still asks them, like, be quiet. It's like, so we end up having it to where Doug is telling that it seems that Clint is really sick, but it seems that Clint is not turning. I guess this only goes into a real true effect with kids, but maybe it doesn't work with adults. So eventually we have it to where we find out that eventually they try to do any number of things to try and get the police present. We eventually have Rebecca hitting her button to call the police. Eventually, the sheriff comes, and ultimately, the sheriff is ultimately going and telling these kids, like, I don't know what all you kids are doing, but Like, I got business to do. I got business to run. And we find out that all these kids end up chomping and eating the sheriff. To ultimately, they're like, no! And so eventually these teachers are there for so long that eventually the parents have to go and pick this kid up for school, and so we end up finding out that one of the kids end up leaving for school like it's a normal day, but they're zombie infected, and we have it to where the mom ends up picking the kid up and opening the van for this kid to come on in, and we find out that the kid is nibbling on the baby that is in the back of the car, which is kind of sad. But the baby ends up turning into a zombie as well, and so we end up having the kid ending up eating the woman in the van, and we have it the entire time where the teachers are, I think, on the roof and ultimately yelling, or ultimately on some balcony where they are telling this woman, like, call 911, don't let your kid into the van, like help us. And so eventually we get it to where the kids end up going and trying to get to this little balcony that these people are on, ends up trying to grab Tracy, and ultimately they are assessing whether this kid is actually infected or not. So we eventually go on to eventually having them desperately run off to, because evidently all the kids are kind of getting together and trying to figure out how to get to the teachers, and so recently they are deciding to uh, try and get seemingly out of this uh, seemingly out of this environment and into some place where they could otherwise hold off. We have it to where Clint is to ultimately go into this ventilation system, uh, because ultimately I think Clint and Lucy had separated, and so we eventually have it to where Wade is talking to Lucy on this walkie-talkie, and ultimately they are mentioning how that Wade had bought her a ring, and ultimately, like, he really loves her and everything like that. And we have it to where Lucy's ultimately telling Wade that, like, she doesn't, like, feel that that she can have a relationship with him and all kinds of stuff, because ultimately death is lurking. And so we have it to where, like, Wade thinks that he can have a private talk with Lucy uh, without Clint hearing. And so Wade is ultimately asking Lucy, it's like, are you alone? Can I talk to you alone? And Lucy says, sure, with all full well Clint is hearing every single thing that Lucy is saying. So Wade goes into talking about how much he loves her and how much, like, he had saw that Clint had made her laugh and how Clint could probably be a really great guy and everything like that. And so we end up having Clint hearing all of this, and eventually we have it to where Clint ends up grabbing the walkie and talking to Wade and say, you know what, I'm not really a great guy. Like, ultimately, like, we have it to where Clint had confessed to Lucy that ultimately he really was a teacher, and ultimately just didn't work out with him because ultimately he wanted to become a writer, and, like, the whole teaching thing was way more complicated than he thought it could be. And so reasonably he wanted to write, but ultimately every single time there was some kind of teaching thing that he needed to do that got in the way of it. So he just kind of got so um, like, kind of bitter at all the students that he had ever teached, because they had so many opportunities that he was never going to have, uh, or had blown away or blown off or whatever, blown a bridge or whatever you want to call the metaphor, burned a bridge, whatever, doing stuff, whatever. Okay. But anyways, we eventually have Clint going on the walkie and mentioning to Wade how Wade is a great guy and all this and that, and Wade is like, mother, like, Lucy, I told you to, I told you to be alone. We have it to where Wade is desperately asking for Lucy to be on the walkie and to not hear Clint like say anything and have to talk to him. And we ultimately have it to where Wade is to talking to Lucy, and then we have it to where Clint ends up grabbing the walkie and interrupting Wade again to ultimately say what his plan is, what his plan of attack is, to ultimately go through the vents and ultimately try to escape through the vents. Ultimately, that's their master plan, and so we end up having Wade again saying, "Shut up, Clint! Like I don't want to talk to you. Like I want to talk to Lucy," and it's freaking hilarious. So we end up having it to where Clint and Lucy are making their way through these vents, and so eventually we have it to where Lucy is going with Clint through these vents because at first, really, Clint was just going by himself, and so eventually we find out that seemingly one of the kids is making their way through these vents as well, and it eventually makes it to where Clint and Lucy go and otherwise not try to go through the vents anymore, and then Clint has to give Wade a heads up that one of the kids is making it through the vents. And so Wade appreciates that Clint had given him the heads up about that so that way they can seal the vent off so the kid doesn't make it through there. So we eventually at some point have Tracy eventually confess that he is gay to all the rest of the teachers, because ultimately we have it when we first meet Tracy. He is talking about playing with a guy's balls and stuff like that, and that ultimately he had a really good time with him and some guy's balls. And ultimately, then he had skewed the story. Told me, he said, "Yeah, like when me and this guy went and played tennis, and the girls were like, like." Like I thought he was finally gonna come out to us, and I thought he was gonna finally tell us that he was gay. Um, but now we have it to where finally Tracy confesses, and ultimately the girls are like, "I knew it." So we go on, and so we have it to where Wade isn't going to take it anymore, and so he is decking everybody out with all kinds of sports equipment that they can possibly have them be put on and make their last stand to ultimately make it out of this school so they can be able to get out of here. So we end up having it to where Wade is all decked out in like football gear, and like there's some people that just have like a lacrosse stick or a hockey stick or some kind of stick of sorts, and that's it. Uh, so we eventually have it uh, to where there are zombie kids that are all starting to chase after all of these teachers, and so we have it to where Wade ends up putting up the sacrifice play. We ultimately have Wade and God, what is there's some other teacher. I think it's Mr. Hatashi that ultimately is seemingly taking out these kids. So we eventually have it to where Wade is tossing the keys to Clint's character, and ultimately saying, "Take care of her." And ultimately, we have Wade who is doing the sacrifice play, where he is trying to take down all these zombies. And ultimately, it seems that eventually he gets swarmed, and zombies are gathering around all around him. And we have it to where we are to assess that Wade had gotten eaten. So we have it to where Clint and all the other teachers end up getting uh, into this vehicle, into this truck of sorts, and they drive off. We eventually seemingly find that there is one of the zombies that end up getting onto this vehicle and making their way onto almost attacking Clint, but eventually they end up taking down this zombie and then running him or backing over him to crush this zombie. That part where we have the kid kind of losing his jaw and stuff like that, that's kind of gross. But when looking at it, Like I've seen several movies like that are just kind of the same thing. Anyways, we eventually have it to where the teachers end up going into yet another environment, and we find out that this environment is some playland of sorts, or it's some kind of like YMCA of sorts, where ultimately there's seemingly like a ton of kids all around everywhere. And ultimately we have the teachers that are ultimately going like, oh my god, I didn't realize what this place actually was, and oh my god, like we're gonna die in here because there's just kids everywhere. And so we eventually have it to where Wade is ultimately going and coming back to say like, yeah, we're definitely gonna rescue all you guys. And so we end up having it to where they're making one real push to just try to get all these kids away. And we ultimately have it to where Wade is consistently spraying them with what looks like water, and Clint is like, "Why are you consistently spraying all these kids with water? This makes no sense." And we have it to where Wade is mentioning it's not water, it's gasoline. And so we have Wade lighting the match of this whole entire play place environment, and it's just lighting up like a Christmas tree. And so we have it where seemingly every single one of the teachers are all going into the truck yet again to drive off, and we ultimately have it to where Clint is ultimately, or one of the people is asking Wade ultimately how he found them, and we have it to where Wade mentions like, well, I can always find my dual reel, my dual wheel reel, my dual reel, and then that's ultimately how the movie just ends with the otherwise win of the teachers to ultimately, I guess, just tell us that eventually they had won this day, and recently that's all that really mattered was them just eventually, I guess, surviving at the end. So that's all I wanted to say about this movie. I thought it was weird and or interesting. There was probably a lot of stuff that I probably had forgotten. Um, I thought it was kind of funny. We had one teacher that ultimately was going to have all the teachers uh, like come with him at some point because he knows CrossFit, and so we end up having the CrossFit teacher ending up going out to get eaten by a bunch of people, and I thought that that was hilarious. Uh, we end up having Doug seemingly losing his effing mind consistently, or to the point where he's consistently mentioning about how many problems that he has. To ultimately, he had mentions that every once in a while he says the wrong cranberry or some like, and ultimately we have it to where Lucy ends up saying the wrong word, and ultimately Doug ultimately says like word brother like West Side or whatever. And we have it to where like he's throwing up some gang signs as a hilarious thing. So recently, eventually, we have it to where like this movie is hilarious, but I think it's also like it's ridiculous, but it's ridiculous, but it's hilarious. They even get to the point of having one of the kids giving Clint a cootie shot at one point, which I thought was funny. To ultimately give Clint his confidence, and so yeah, I really liked that. I thought it was kind of like it was fun. Stuff was fun about this movie, and ultimately, I just kind of really enjoyed it. It kind of reminded me very much of the movie Faculty, but in kind of like an opposite kind of respect. So, anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.